Well, thanks again for tuning in. My name is Reuven Sussman, and I'm here at the back end of today's webinar with Maxine Chicumbo. We work at ACEEE, the American Council for an Energy Efficient Economy, and ACEEE is one of the co-conveners of the BECC conference, Behavior, Energy, and Climate Change. I myself am one of the co-chairs of this conference, and Maxine works on the communications for that conference as well. So thank you for coming, and I just wanted to start by letting you know that the BECC conference is coming up very soon, December 7th to 10th. And for those of you tuning in, you get a very special gift, and that is a discounted rate. So if you go to the BECC website now and register before, I think it's before Monday or Tuesday, then you can get the special rate using the BECC 2020 code, and that is a significant discount. So please go check it out. This is our last webinar before the conference, so go now. I also wanted to draw attention to our conference sponsors who also sponsor this particular webinar. Without them, these webinars wouldn't be possible. I highly recommend you check out the work these organizations are doing in this area, and lend them your support. This is the last webinar before the new year, so remember to register for BECC using our discount code, and we'll see you on the other side. We've done 10 webinars this year, this being our 10th one, and we're very proud of the series. So please join us again next year for when the webinar starts, and join us at the conference. So a little housekeeping, some logistics before we get started. All attendees are currently in listen-only mode. We'll have time for questions after the presentation, although if you type them into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, we can answer some of them as we go. And then at the end, Maxine will ask questions to our speaker, Shahzeen Attari. The webinar is being recorded, so no need to furiously write down everything. We'll send you a link after the webinar. And just one more little tidbit about the system we're using, On24. Sometimes we use On24, sometimes we use GoToWebinar. This time we're using On24, which means your screen is customizable. So feel free to make the various windows as large or as small as you like. You can even minimize them to drop to the menu at the bottom of your screen. Click through the widgets at the bottom of your screen to be sure that you aren't missing any of the available options. So that's it in terms of housekeeping. Now I'm going to turn it over to today's speaker. Shahzeen Attari is an associate professor at the O'Neill School of Public and Environmental Affairs at Indiana University in Bloomington. Shahzeen's research focuses on people's judgments and decisions about climate change and resource use. Some of her research has investigated how people think about how energy and water use, and how people conceptualize water systems, and how the carbon footprint of climate communicators affects their audience's policy support, which is super interesting stuff. Among other projects, she is currently studying how to use stories to fuse facts and feelings to motivate climate action on climate change. She's an associate professor, as I mentioned, and you can find out more about her and her research at her website. It is www.sz, or Z if you're in the United States, Attari, like the old gaming system, but with 2 T's. So SZATTARI.com. Thank you so much, Shahzeen, for joining us. You can turn on your webcam now, and please take it away.
All right. Hello, everyone. I'm sitting in the woods in Bloomington, Indiana, and I'm super happy to be with you today to talk to you about some of our research. So today, the topic is fusing facts and feelings to motivate action on climate change. You can find all of the papers that I'll be talking about on the website that Reuven just mentioned, and I'm actually looking forward to an engaged discussion, so I'll try to end a few minutes early so that we can talk about it, or you can also email me or reach out to me via Twitter. So 2 of the big challenges that we face today, or at least the ones that I am super worried about that give me sleepless nights, are how do we stabilize carbon dioxide concentration in the atmosphere to limit warming? And if we're not successful on the first, how do we think through deep adaptation to climate change in order to limit welfare loss, both in the United States and the world writ large? And so these are the two big challenges that I've been thinking about for the past decade or so. And I'll be talking to you today about a variety of papers that have been published in our lab, trying to sort of piece apart these two questions. So what is the problem of climate change? So we are on a path of a few current policies in order to deal with the problem. We've already warmed our surface by 1 degree Celsius. There are people that are talking about a 1.5 degree Celsius path, but a lot of people say that that might not be very achievable. And so the question is, what we do today has huge ramifications for where we end up along this sort of fan out curve of future options. The other challenges is, all right, where does a lot of our greenhouse gas emissions come from? And primarily it comes from energy use, which is both in industry, transport, buildings, and then also from agriculture and forestry land use. Waste and industry also contribute a small amount. So a lot of my work really focuses on two separate pieces in terms of how to motivate action. In general, I study decisions at the individual level, but also how individuals feed into a larger system. But the first piece that I really look at is, all right, do we know what the problem is? Do we understand what's causing the problem? What should we be doing? How to do what we should be doing? And the second piece that I look at is motivation. Are we effectively motivated to act on the problem of climate change? And to be honest, historically, our lab has been doing this sort of lockstep, information, motivation. But now, especially with the new research that I'll be talking to you about at the end of this talk, we're sort of trying to combine motivation and information together to understand how stories can be leveraged to get people to act. Both in terms of individuals, but also larger system-wide changes that we need in order to mitigate the problem of climate change, but also think through some adaptation policies. So to start with, I'm going to sort of talk, my talk today is divided into 3 parts. The first part is some of the work that I've done on people's perceptions. The second part is about climate communication. And the third part is about storytelling. So in terms of published work on people's perceptions of energy use, the first is actually from my PhD work that was published in 2010, and some more recent work that ties in together with some of the prior work, looking at, all right, how do people think about how much energy different appliances use? What are the most effective behaviors that people can do? And also, what do people want the future energy mix to look like in the year 2050? So for the first paper, we actually asked our sample, our participants, which were all online participants. And in fact, all the data I'll be showing you today are convenient sample, all online participants, and primarily in the United States. We do have other work that is more representative, but I will not be talking about that today. So the first question we asked our participants is, in your opinion, what is the most effective thing that you could do to conserve energy in your life? And the top answer that we received was turning off the lights. Roughly 20% of our participants said turning off the lights is the most effective thing that they can do, followed by conserving energy, driving less, shutting off appliances, not having children, sleeping more, relaxing more, and there's just no way I don't know how to do it. The problem with turning off the lights is that this heuristic, or this rule of decision-making, especially in terms of what is most effective, has been a sticky, incorrect heuristic since the 1980s. So some of Willett Kempton's original work on this issue actually showed that when people were asked back in the 1980s, what is the most effective thing, people still mentioned turning off the lights. So as Gardner and Stern say, behaviors that are easiest to remember and perform, for example, turning off the lights when leaving the room, tend to have a minimal impact on climate change. All right, so what does have a really big impact on climate change? This is work from Seth Wines and Kimberly Nicholas, and they actually categorize behaviors into low impact, moderate impact, and high impact. And some of the behaviors in the high impact range are eating a plant-based diet, buying an electric vehicle, going solar or wind, so on and so forth. So there are effective behaviors that people can do. But in terms of advocacy and action, especially where we find ourselves today, we really, especially when I teach students, I always say you have to think of yourself as a climate person. ask yourself, what can I do now and what can I do next? And always think about what you can do next. And that helps you avoid the single action bias, which basically says, all right, there's just one thing, I'm going to do it and then move on to the next problem. A friend of mine, Mary Anais Hegler, says, do what you're good at and do your best. And if you're good at making noise, make all the noise you can. So that's one sort of nugget that I'd like to leave you with, especially at this juncture. Now, going back to the science, some of the original work, especially given my background in physics, I was really curious to understand, all right, we're constantly using energy in terms of heating and lighting and motion. Do people really have a good understanding of how much energy different appliances use, especially given how much our dependence on energy, which is mostly fossil fuel based, really feeds into the problem of climate change through greenhouse gas emissions. So over here on the y-axis, you have people's perceptions of energy used or saved, and on the x-axis, you have actual energy used or saved. Data that falls along the diagonal y is equal to x line means people's perceptions match reality. Now, the challenge is, I know a lot of you, especially in the energy world, know what a watt hour is and know the difference between watt hours and BTUs and the difference between watts and watt hours. And I've spent a lot of time trying to explain to people the difference between power and energy, but most people don't know or don't understand that distinction. So what we did in this study, we said, all right, imagine a 100-watt light bulb is left on for 1 hour. It uses 100 units of energy in that hour. How many units of energy would your dishwasher take, or your air conditioner, or your computer, or your laptop? And so here is the overall trend in the data. And what you can see is most of the data lies below the diagonal line. So there's this huge underestimation because people think these higher end use devices use a lot less energy than what they actually do. But let me walk you through some specific examples. So laptops are overestimated by a factor of 2. So people think that they're equivalent to 1 light bulb when they're actually equivalent to half. Dishwashers are underestimated by a factor of 9. So people think they're equivalent to 2 light bulbs when they're actually equivalent to 18 light bulbs. And finally, changing the setting on your washer, your clothes washer, from hot to cold was underestimated by a factor of 40. So people think it's equivalent to saving 1 light bulb when it's actually equivalent to saving 40 light bulbs. So this work sort of showed that people really have strong misperceptions about how much energy different appliances use. And maybe it's the case we don't need to know how much energy, how many watt hours my clothes washer uses, but we should try to think about how to rank order these appliances correctly. And we fail there as well. So then the question is how do you hold on to this curve and pull it up towards the diagonal? And some of our more recent work that was published last year looks at, all right, what if I gave participants an expert heuristic, an expert rule of decision making? And I just told them, all right, large appliances that primarily heat and cool things use a lot more energy than people think. Would that help people understand better? Like, would that actually help pull that perception curve towards the diagonal? And this is a paper published with Tyler Margettis and David Landy. And what we find is that, yes, indeed, it does. So let me walk you through some of this data. We replicated the 2010 data in 2019. So that's what the baseline data is. With a random group, with a randomized experimental design, the group that was given just the heuristic had a steeper slope. So that curve was actually pulled up towards the diagonal when we just gave them a heuristic. Alternatively, when you give people 3 anchors or 3 data points along the curve, a low, medium, and high, that pulls people's perception curve up even more steeply. And finally, the black line is when you give them both 3 anchors as well as the heuristic. So different things are going on here. The heuristic actually helps me understand, all right, these appliances use a lot more energy than others. The anchors basically allow me to gear shift in between low energy use, medium energy use, and high energy use. So this is a really fascinating way to get people to understand energy a lot better than sort of necessarily teaching them about basic principles in physics. And so what we're currently doing is we've created a library of energy heuristics by interviewing 30 different energy experts, physicists, electrical engineers, and subject matter experts. And we've created this library of heuristics. And next, we're going to actually work on breaking apart faulty heuristics, like the one I showed you earlier, which is turning off the lights is really effective. So that's current work, so stay tuned. The last piece in this sort of library of work that I wanted to show you was a paper that was published earlier this year by Deidre Miniard and Joe Kattenbacher. In this paper, we really were curious to understand, what do people want the future energy mix in the year 2050 to look like? So we asked participants, roughly 2,500 of them, what they think the current energy mix is in the United States and what they hope the future energy mix would look like in the year 2050. Now here, when we use the term energy mix, we're including electricity, transportation, industry, commercial, and residential. So it's the entire mix of energy rather than just electricity. So here is some of the data. Here is the actual amount of energy from different energy sources: oil, natural gas, coal, nuclear, biomass, hydro, wind, solar, and geothermal. And the dot represents our current consumption of that particular resource last year. Now, here are people's perceptions. Now, in general, we divide up our participants into conservatives, moderates, and liberals, and these were self-identified into these three groups. What we find is that in general, participants tend to underestimate the amount of oil and natural gas in our current energy mix. They tend to overestimate the amount of coal, and that reason might be because the recent complete transformation of moving away from coal and towards natural gas might not have been a point that a lot of our participants knew about. And they also tend to overestimate the amount of wind and solar, as well as geothermal and hydro. Now, what's really interesting is that what we see here is both conservatives, moderates, and liberals want a future energy mix in the year 2050 that is really severely decarbonized. We do not see significant partisan differences in this hope, in this vision for the future. And in fact, we argue in the paper that there is a shared vision for what the future energy mix should look like in the year 2050. Severely decarbonized, so a huge decrease in oil, natural gas, and coal, and huge increases in wind and solar energy. So that's great news. Now the challenge is, how do we get there in the year 2050 from where we are here today? So unfortunately, this is where the differences start arising. So we asked about policy support for 6 different decarbonization policies and 6 anti-decarbonization policies, or pro-fossil fuel policies. And what you notice in the trend is that in general, liberals have more support for decarbonization policies and a lot of opposition for anti-decarbonization policies. And this trend holds for all of the policies except for nuclear, where it's relatively flatlined. So, all right, we have a future mix that we want, but we do not have strong agreement on how to get from where we are today to this future energy mix where we're severely decarbonized. So that's a big challenge. The second big challenge is deals with the problem of climate change. And we got to see a lot of it act out in the past election, as in like last week. And what we noticed here is that climate change is an important problem for the US today. So over here you have 4 separate problems: climate change, economy and jobs, access to quality healthcare, and immigration. And what we find is that the similar trends for economy and jobs, immigration, and access to quality healthcare in general, but very different trend for climate change. And here what we find is that climate change seems to be a futures problem, and there's a much larger split between conservatives and liberals. And we actually got to see this play out last week. So climate change seems to be a much more of a liberal salient issue than it is for conservatives. And it's also a much more of a futures problem than a problem right now today, especially for the United States. So in summary, for this line of work is that we have great news. Both conservatives and liberals want a decarbonized future energy mix, a significant decrease in fossil fuel use, significant increase in solar and wind. But the challenging news is that there are strong differences between liberals and conservatives in their support for these different policies in order to get from where we are today to where we need to go in 2050. So with that, I'm going to end sort of this first chapter, and I'm going to start the second chapter of my talk. So the second the second sort of chapter of work that I'd like to talk to you about today is what is the role of individuals, especially individual communicators like myself, in sort of conveying information to an audience, and what happens with both information uptake in terms of changing one's own behavior and supporting policies when it comes to my carbon footprint. The reason why I was really interested in this area of research is because when I was a postdoctoral fellow, I went to a conference and someone sort of stood up and said, "Hey, you're talking about climate change. You flew to this meeting. I don't want to hear anything you have to say." So being the nerdy academic that I am, I wanted to actually study the phenomena of these ad hominem attacks, which are attacking the person rather than the argument. And this line of research has been done with my wonderful postdoc mentors, Elke Weber and Dave Krantz. And then also Greg Sparkman, who's just joined our team to sort of investigate these features in this line of attack. And so what is an ad hominem attack? It's to the person rather than to the argument. And this happens quite vehemently across all areas. And so the Tyndall Center actually have this wonderful white paper that now they've published, where they highlight that academic researchers are among the highest emitters, primarily due to flying to conferences, project meetings, and field work. They also argue that the research community needs a roadmap to reduce our emissions. So that's great. So now the question is, where does that make sense? So both Peter Kalmus and Eric Holthaus, who both work in the climate change world, they looked at their own carbon footprints. And in fact, air travel does dominate their carbon footprint. And so there's been this huge push about getting climate researchers and scientists and social scientists to sort of change their own behavior in order for them to facilitate a larger change. And I want to be extremely clear here with my language. I particularly do not believe that we can solve the climate problem with just individual behavior. But I do think we need individuals, because individuals are part of the larger system, in order to get the system-wide transition, both in terms of our energy system, but also our transportation system, our consumption food lines, the life cycle of our entire production and consumption web, where we live. So I just want to be very clear about that in case anyone thinks that I'm advocating for advocating for a solution being just individuals decreasing their carbon footprint. I think that there's room for that. We need that, but we need so much more than that. All right, so that was my big caveat. All right, so let me get to the data. So what we did was we had separate experimental vignettes, and I'm going to show you a whole ton of experimental vignettes today, where we actually investigated, all right, what if you have a climate communicator who has a high carbon footprint or a low carbon footprint, or if they're female or male, or if they have a high carbon footprint, but then they buy offsets, or they have a super efficient home or not very efficient home, what happens to their credibility? And so here's our first set of data. On the y-axis, you have people's credibility, and this was a scale that we created to measure the vignette, the person that we talk about in the experimental vignette, how credible the participant finds them in terms of whether they believe them, whether they want to hear what they have to say, whether they want to act on what they just heard. And here are some patterns in the data. So you have the least amount of credibility when you have a high home energy footprint, and you have the highest credibility when you have a low home energy footprint. So that's great. Next, high fly and low fly are similar for males and females, which is wonderful news, where females and male scientists are judged by the same standards based on this evidence. And then buying offsets does not wipe the slate clean. It is somewhere between high fly and low fly. So what this shows is that there are huge variations in how credible participants found the climate communicator in these experimental vignettes. And this was a between subject design. In the second study, we really wanted to tweak, all right, number one, we wanted to replicate what we found. And number two, we also wanted to say, all right, what if you later learn that the climate researcher flew to this meeting? Or, an audience raised their hand, very similar to what happened to me, and they asked this question: would that create a difference in the mean credibility rating for those researchers? And and here are the data. So one is the original data that I just showed you. LL is later you learn, and AQ is an audience question. And what we see is that the pattern holds. The offsets are somewhere in between high and low. And then high home has the least amount of credibility, and low home has the highest amount of credibility. Now, these patterns of credibility actually relate to whether the participant is willing to change their own behaviors. So we asked our participants, are they willing to save home energy, fly less, or use public transport more? And what we see is that I'm going to just show you the save home energy use, is as you go from low researcher credibility to high researcher credibility, what we find is the percentage of participants that are willing to save energy in their home go from 29% all the way up to 90%. Again, huge results, huge finding. And so even though flying dominates my carbon footprint, and for many academic researchers, novices actually use the home energy use as the litmus test for hypocrisy and not flying. There could be many reasons for this. They might forgive flying and think that maybe it's because of their job or something else that requires me to fly. But this was also an interesting finding that I wanted to share with you. So in summary for this paper, ad hominem attacks based on personal energy use can be highly effective. And also these credibility results on credibility and intentions to save energy occur for varied audiences, both audiences who believe that climate change is important as well as those who do not. Now, when this paper came out, a lot of people said, hey, changing behavior is great, but we really need policy. And as you heard from my earlier caveat, I am in this camp that we do need a lot of policy when it comes to climate change, especially if we want to avoid a disastrous warming path. And so what we really wanted to do here is we wanted to test policy support for a variety of different policies by having both a high carbon footprint and a low carbon footprint. And here are the 6 different policies we looked at: regulating carbon dioxide as a pollutant, taxing carbon emissions, increasing nuclear power, stabilizing human population, increasing renewable energy, and increasing public transit. And that was followed by either a high home energy use climate communicator or a low home energy use climate communicator. And again, this was an experimental vignette between participants. So what's interesting here is that here on the y-axis you have policy support, and on the x-axis you have condition. We've arranged the policies based on highest support, which you have for renewable, and lowest support, which not surprisingly you have for population stabilization. And what you see is that there's a sort of stepwise function that keeps going on. And what that indicates is that when you have a high carbon footprint, you have less policy support than if you have a low carbon footprint. And that holds across all of the policies except for renewable, where the differences are not statistically significant. And one reason for that is because we have a lot of overwhelming support for renewable energy already. So that was really interesting. Then what we wanted to understand is, all right, let's say if I was a climate sinner, what happens if I become a climate saint? I went to Catholic school in the Middle East, and it's sort of tied into some of my background. So we had 3 levels of reformation: no reform, some reform, and complete reform. And here and I'm going to skip over this and just show you the data. So here you have on the y-axis your credibility score, the original study, and this is the reformation data. What you find is that no reform is similar to having a high carbon footprint, and complete reform or some reform gets us closer to having a low carbon footprint. So what's really fascinating about this is that we do not get judged based on our past climate sins, but we actually get judged based on our current carbon footprint. And last but not least, in terms of the 3 papers I wanted to talk to you about in this chapter, this is work done with Greg Sparkman, where we looked at Dogooder derogation. So is it problematic to be really too good? So, I'm a climate scientist and I'm vegan and I don't fly and I live in a really small home and I don't have kids and ... So we had three separate conditions: unsustainable, fairly sustainable, and extremely sustainable for both a neighbor and an expert. And what we find is that experts who are highly sustainable actually don't gain that much in comparison to being somewhat sustainable. But they really need to be in the sustainable category rather than unsustainable, which neighbors are forgiven for, but not as much in terms of experts. So we do find some marginal evidence for do-gooder derogation, that it's important to be good, but not too good where you're off-putting to the people that you're trying to communicate to. So last but not least, this is the summary for all of the work I've shown you in this chapter. The ad hominem attacks based on a personal energy use for a climate researcher is very effective. The credibility slate can be wiped clean. This partial evidence for do-gooder derogation, where highly sustainable advocates were not more influential than somewhat sustainable, and instead they were marginally worse off. And experts are most credible and influential when they adopt many sustainable behaviors in their day-to-day lives, so long as they're not seen as too extreme by their audience. And then that requires you to know who your audience is. So that was the second chapter. And I'm going to try to sort of go through this relatively quickly in terms of the new idea that I'm super excited about to work on. And this is an idea that I've been chewing on for a while. So if you have insights or tendrils that I can follow, please feel free to share them with me. So what I'm really interested in is a lot of the work I showed you. The first chapter focused on information, the second on motivation, how do you effectively motivate people? And now we really need to think about fusing motivation and information, especially today. So I mentioned the election, and climate change, even though it's becoming more salient, it was still not as salient of an issue in terms of voting and in terms of sort of first agenda items for what we need to be doing. And so the challenge is that how do we make climate change more salient? I, for one, love stories because they include artistry and actionable plans. They show how a problem was solved. They have heroes and heroines, and they have analogies and images. And I think, to quote Richard Powers from the Overstory, he actually says, the best arguments in the world won't change a person's mind. The only thing that can do that is a good story. And this is a phenomenal book. If you haven't read it, it's all about trees. I highly recommend. And so I started asking people, all right, what stories have changed you? What have changed your thinking and how you look at the world and how you operate in the world? And that was probably not a very good research question to ask people, because I got a whole variety of answers, and this is just a smattering of them. Everything from the Bible to Harry Potter to Atlas Shrugged to The Matrix to Ursula Le Guin's The Dispossessed, so on and so forth. So a huge plethora of stories work to change individuals, and there's a lot of individual differences in terms of what stories work for whom. And so trying to take a step back and trying to think through different stories. This is a classic scene from Lord of the Rings. This is Gandalf facing the Balrog. And it's a really powerful scene, at least to me, because I can still just close my eyes and imagine Gandalf saying, "You shall not pass." And again, this is tied to David and Goliath, the little person against the big person, the big sort of demon. And maybe in many ways, this is climate change, because climate change is a hyper object. It's a crazy problem. And it has so many moving parts that we might need to rethink how we present the problem of climate change, both in terms of the problem and the solution space. So what I've been thinking about doing is, what is the fact, which is, what should I do about the situation? What is my call to action? And the feeling, how do I feel about the situation? And how do I increase the intensity of feeling? And so these are all just tendrils and ideas that I've been chewing on, and I'd love to talk to you more about it if you're interested. But there are lots of features about what makes a narrative memorable. I've been thinking through this idea of emotional and cognitive scaffolding. And what do I mean by that? So just as the heuristics that I showed you earlier on, that large appliances that heat and cool things use a lot more energy than people think, that provides people a cognitive scaffolding for when they face the energy landscape. It allows people to sort of look at a variety of different tasks or a variety of different appliances and very quickly separate out the high energy users using that rule from the low low energy users. It's not perfect by any means, because there are some energy appliances that use a lot of energy, but that do not heat or cool things. And so there is some error, but the error rate can be small if we sort of think through the heuristics a little bit better. That said, that heuristic does not provide any emotional scaffolding. So there's no impetus for the individual to remember emotionally, because there's no emotional salience to remember that heuristic. And that's what we need to combine. We need to combine emotion and cognition. We also need to have implementation plans and what those look like. And finally, there are lots of challenges that I'd like to talk to you guys about. Deep narratives take time to influence behavior. So it's not that you read something and immediately necessarily you change your life. It might take time to sort of sink in and sort of embed into one's own cognition. We need to move beyond marketing so that we're not selling a specific policy, but rather why we need climate policies more generally. And the big task that we have ahead, especially for our community, is how do we bridge this growing partisanship when it comes to climate change, both in terms of climate change solutions, the Green New Deal, climate action, so on and so forth. So current ideas are ways to bridge the partisan divide through stories. We need to evolve less useful cultural heuristics to more effective ones. And then how do people think about the future and feel about the future? Like, what does 2050 look like for people? So we know that they want the energy mix to be decarbonized. But if we were to tell people, all right, imagine that you're going to be on the same path that we're on today, looking at sort of a shared socio-political pathway, what does the future look like to you? Is it dystopic or utopic? How does it feel? Like, is there some unraveling that happens when we actually engage people with much more open-ended world building? And so that's sort of some of the space that I'm in right now, and I'd love to get your thoughts and feedback. And to summarize, and this is my last slide, I wanted to save some time for discussion. We need to fuse facts and feelings, information and motivation to foster useful change. We need to break down faulty heuristics and embed useful heuristics in stories. We need to make people feel more powerful, especially when it comes to climate action, because it can feel like such a large problem where individuals don't have a part to play. But I actually will argue that I think individuals need to be harnessed in order to successfully transition our system. And finally, conservatives and liberals share a beautiful vision for a decarbonized future energy system, but they do not share pathways of getting there. So we really need to figure out, how do we get people to share pathways or imagine the future system and maybe backcast and figure out, all right, that's where I want to go. And given where I am now, how do I get to where I want to go? And so thank you so much for your attention. And I look forward to a really engaging discussion. Thank you.
Thanks, Shaz. That was great. Really interesting work. I'm especially interested in perceptions of people who are climate activists or doing climate research and their behavior and how that affects the interpretation of what they have to say. I'd like to invite everybody now to, if you haven't already done so, send your messages through the Q&A box, and Shaz will do her best. Sorry, Dr. Attari will do her best to answer as many of those as possible in the time we have. Just a reminder that if you are interested in registering for BECC, go to the BECC website and use the registration code BECC2020. And you can do that, up until Tuesday. So let's get to some of these questions. Maxine, are you there? Do you have some questions for us?
Yes, so one question we have here, when you talk about stories, do you think more about new stories generated by the audience or the application of existing stories?
So that's a great question. We're just starting to think about how to empirically and qualitatively and quantitatively test some of these ideas. And I think partially we need people to create their own stories because that's a lot more powerful. And so I think I oscillate between wanting to use existing story types and story structures, and I'm sort of there's sort of some classic story arcs and story structures, but also wanting to understand what are some stories that people tell themselves about where they're headed in the future and what role climate change is going to play. So more descriptive and prescriptive, but I'm kind of, it's a very difficult project because stories are really hard to study, especially quantitatively. So if you have ideas on how to study them, I'm all yours. Thank you.
Okay, another question here. Are there any effective strategies to get cooling equipment owners to do labor-intensive preventative maintenance for energy savings when they shun labor and want automatic solutions?
So some of the work, I mean, I've not worked directly on that topic, but some insightful work from Greg Sparkman and others show that you can tell people, you can give people dynamic norms, especially if they're correct, saying, hey, you know, there are a lot more people, especially there are a lot more people doing this action now than what the number of people that are actually at baseline. And that actually increases the number of people that want to do that particular action. So he's tested this with people choosing a vegetarian meal for lunch. And so you might be able to do that with other tasks by showing people that the dynamic norm is in favor of doing a particular action. But if something is really hard to do, like what you're describing, I think then the types of interventions that you might need would necessarily need to be more targeted or more thought out than just sort of something that I just come up with on the spot.
Okay, another question here. Are there any existing examples of successfully incorporating storytelling or narratives into policy that you've looked at?
I have not looked at that as yet. As I said, this was like an area of brand new research for us, like a tendril almost, not sort of published papers or anything. I think, but just anecdotally, I think that the Green New Deal, when it first came out, and when it was not co-opted, was a really powerful story because it was a story that combined justice and labor and climate action, and it showed us, you know, a green new world. And I think that that was really powerful. And then, you know, others have studied how initially there was a lot of conservative and liberal support for the Green New Deal, but once sort of Fox News and other news organizations started sort of pushing particular news items about it or reporting on it in particular ways, that really changed the narrative. And so just like frames, where we can frame something in frame A or frame B, can be powerful in the moment, they can always be reframed. And so I think that the Green New Deal in terms of policy is just actually a beautiful story. And it's like a beautiful vision of the world too, in my humble opinion.
Okay, another question here. It seems very difficult to know about an expert's home energy use. So any insight into how people make this judgment? In other words, how can a low household person convince others they are low impact?
Beautiful. So in general, a lot of active climate communicators talk about what they've done in their lives in order to decrease their climate footprint or their carbon footprint. So if you look at folks like Catherine Hayhoe, if you look at folks like Michael Mann, they all really talk about, hey, you know, this is what I've done as an individual. It is nowhere enough. We need to change the system. But here's what you can do as an individual and become the climate person and always ask what is next. So it usually comes up with either the climate communicator openly discussing what they do, or in my experience, it comes up in Q&A, where whenever I give public talks about climate change, I almost always get asked, hey, what have you done and what can I do? And so people want to understand, hey, what is in the realm of possibility and also be given permission to ask that question and engage in what they can do, what they've done, what they could be doing next. So I think it comes up to both the climate communicator offering that information, as well as people asking for that information from the climate communicator, specifically for public audiences. Thank you for your question.
Great. Another question here. Are you looking into getting climate change impacts embedded in TV shows? I know that I think this is American Lung Association, works on getting no smoking messages into TV shows, so they probably know how to collect metrics on effectiveness.
So there's actually an active group that is doing that already, and they're super active on it. It's been a long day, so I've forgotten their name, but if you type in AAAS and you look at entertainment and science, there's actually a group that's actually working with Hollywood producers and TV shows, so on and so forth, to embed climate change information into lots of shows. And it's already starting to happen. Like, I'm a huge sci-fi nerd, and there's so much out there right now. I mean, there's so much out there, but there needs to be a lot more. And there's a lot of information that's being embedded, everything from like The Expanse, which is an amazing show that talks about why, why we reach for the stars and, live in asteroids, all the way to, there was an amazing British show last year, but I've forgotten the name, sorry. Sort of when I'm active mode, I tend to forget names pretty quickly. But if you email me, I can send you some of my favorites.
Okay, another question here. I think this might be in relation to the issue of not traveling and doing more virtual events. Do you think doing virtual meetings and outreach will make speakers more credible in this space?
I don't know. That's a really good question. We've not studied, we have studied vignettes or experimental vignettes where we say that the climate communicator has given up flying altogether, or the climate communicator only flies once or twice a year. And that does increase credibility, not as much as home energy use, but it does increase credibility. But specifically presuming, and this is a personal answer, not based on data. So I want to caveat my answer based on that. I want to be careful about, this is not based on data that we've collected. There are advantages and disadvantages of these types of events. I mean, I love the fact that I can, in a very short space of time, sitting in the woods in Bloomington, sort of talk to you about our research, and sort of reach so many people and also be able to interact with so many people. But there is something different about sort of sitting across from someone and looking at their facial expressions and having, a beer with them and being like, hey, let's try to figure out these ideas together. So I think that I do miss, and partially it's also like living by myself, I miss social interactions, but there is a huge space for these types of virtual meetings, and I'm happy to have both. But I think that there are pluses and minuses for both as well. But that's my answer, not based on data.
Great. Another question here. I'm curious to hear about an example you can share on combining heuristics and emotional scaffolding, either in the energy climate sphere that you're considering or where you have seen this done well in other fields tackling complex challenges.
Okay, I can tell you one that sticks with me because it's very sticky. It's not the most effective heuristic, but it is a heuristic. So in the Overstory, which is this book I recommended, Richard Powers is like this phenomenal writer, and he's able to connect using a piece of tissue paper, a piece of toilet paper, to the great redwood trees. And so after I read that, I actually noticed I changed my own behavior in trying to conserve how much toilet paper I use. And again, it's not the most effective thing you can do. So that's why I wanted to be careful in sort of caveating that. But that's one example. There are probably a lot of other examples. So I know heuristics are used a lot in medical decision-making. So when doctors or nurses treat someone, they sort of have a quick quick list, quick heuristic list, but it's not very embedded in emotion. But I think that the closest quick answer I can give you is this idea from Richard Powers, where he is able to make me feel for the redwood tree. And I know it sounds really like woo-woo, but it isn't. It just, after you read that paragraph and you go and use toilet paper, it's just like you connect the entire life cycle back to the redwood tree. And it's insane. For me, again, different stories for different people, different scaffolding for different people. But that for me was really powerful.
All right. Can you highlight research looking at using these motivational tools to affect real behavior outside of a lab or an artificial setting, especially in terms of long-term behavior, perhaps something similar to studies of home energy reports?
Okay. So there are tons. I mean, there's this whole field, and Reuben knows a lot of this work too. And if you go to BECC, you'll see a lot of the. Let me give you two quick examples. One is O-Power. Used to be O-Power, now it's, I think, changed names or changed owners. But they basically said, all right, this is how much energy you're using compared to your most efficient neighbor. And that actually led to a decrease in energy use by around 2 to 3% that was maintained over a long period of time. It's also being done in the water sector using the same method. And I think that they're trying to combine this norm information with more effective. So they have a little sort of blurb at the bottom, which, these are the more effective things you can be doing in your home if you haven't already done them. So they're trying to combine more useful information in with this norm information, which is what we're doing to neighbors. That's one example. A second example actually comes from BECC. So many years ago when I was attending BECC, they had their main luncheon, and this was in person. Their main luncheon used to be a meat lunch, and then we'd have to ask for the vegetarian option. I'm vegetarian. And so they then flipped it, because we know that green defaults are very sticky. So the next year they said, all right, everyone gets a vegetarian lunch, and if you want a meat lunch, you can ask for one. And most people stuck to the default. So defaults we know are really sticky. And so that's one way that they got a lot. I mean, they greened their entire conference, which has hundreds and hundreds of people that attended in person at that time. So those are two examples, but this is a whole field. I mean, people are constantly testing, testing both in the lab and then taking it from the lab into the real world. And then we fail in the lab and we fail in the real world. And then we keep iterating, just as any other field in science and social science. It's sort of a very quick, hopefully very quick way of sort of learning what are the most effective ways of influencing specific behaviors. But hopefully that answers your question. Just two simple examples.
Okay, this is a twofold question. Have you received feedback for the question you posed? How do you view the future? Were there more responses for a dystopian or utopian future? And on the same vein, have you found that positive storytelling is more effective than doom and gloom stories?
Yeah, that is a great question. Hope or despair? I think it's like Janus, right? Looking into the future and looking into the past. I think, okay, so many ideas, and I need to slow down my mind so that I can actually speak them out. Yes, we have looked at it only for Gen Z. So we actually have roughly a couple of hundred students that we actually ask these questions to about how do they imagine the future, and we analyze their open-ended responses. So stay tuned for those results. But in general, it depends. Some people are technocrats and they think, all right, technology is going to solve everything. And some people are really, really worried and wait for a few more months for the paper to come out. And if not, send me a note and I'll try to find you some of our data. But basically, it depends on the person that we ask. But in general, with our Gen Z audience that is from Indiana and non-environmental students, there were a lot of dystopian futures. Now to the second question, do dystopic or utopic futures motivate more? I think it varies. I think some utopian futures motivate more and some dystopian futures motivate more. And I'm just speaking from personal experience and from talking to a small set of people. So I'm a huge, as I mentioned earlier, I'm a huge sci-fi nerd, and I And reading Octavia Butler's Parable of the Sower, Parable of the Talent, it shows one way of where we're headed. Kim Stanley Robinson talks about what New York City is going to look like in 2140, and that's terrifying, but also kind of beautiful because he's able to make me feel like I live in 2140. So stories have this magical power of making me experience things without actually having me experience them. And so I think unleashing that in a way that actually helps people, especially given the data I've shown you that makes people think that the future is far away, is something that I think stories can be leveraged to do. But the challenge is that different stories work for different people. Not everyone wants to read Kim Stanley Robinson or Octavia Butler. So that's a huge challenge. So again, if people are working on this, please reach out to me. And I have a lot to learn. Thank you.
So there are a couple of questions kind of related to this one. And you just mentioned this about using different stories for different people. How do we connect to the right story for the right group?
I think we have to test it, and we have to I think there are lots of challenges with stories. But rather than talking about, stories mean different things for different people. Rather than talking about stories, let me just talk about narrative lines. And there are some narrative lines that are really problematic in the climate space. One narrative is individuals don't matter. So don't change your behavior because individuals don't matter. And I've heard that time and time again, where individual action is pitted against policy and against policy, top-down policy, as if it's a false dichotomy, because in order to have the policies, including a price on carbon, which we've been talking about for decades, we need political will and public support. So that is a problematic narrative that individuals are pitted against the system. Another problematic narrative, I think, especially in the climate community, which is less in the novice community, is do we need nuclear energy or is it just wind, water, solar? That's another narrative, is that, all right, what are the specific tendrils and what are the specific technologies we're going to pick for the future? And so I think these are very simplified stories or narratives that can be tested. And that's what we're working on right now, testing who do these narratives work for and why. So stay tuned. I don't have an answer to your question as to which ones actually work, but I can tell that you're interested in finding out just as I am. So I'm holding on to the edge of my seat as well. Thank you.
We have so many questions, Shaz, so many questions, so many great comments, a lot discussing, the emphasis on storytelling and what they like about it, people mentioning bipartisan agreements that are being worked on, and just lots that we can't get to. But let's let Maxine ask a few more. I think if it's okay with you, we'll go a little bit over time, and then we'll wrap it up. And I just want to remind everybody again that you can register for BECC using the BECC code BECC 2020 at the BECC registration website, and that's available until Tuesday. Okay, go ahead.
Sure. So have you figured out how to address the label of fake news regarding the impacts of climate change? This labeling is a form of storytelling.
Oh, yeah. So others are working on that. So we have a group here at Indiana University looking at how, both the label of fake news, but also how fake news spreads and how to stop it from spreading. And there's also a group out of Oxford, Cambridge, Sander van der Linden and others who are creating methods to inoculate people, to help them be able to become better detectors of fake news. I think that is really challenging. It is really challenging. And here's why. So especially in this election, it was really challenging. This was my first year voting. I just became a U.S. citizen in December 2019. Super excited to vote. And, but at the same time, I also feel like our democracy is in a difficult situation. So I haven't looked myself at sort of fake news specifically, but there are lots and lots of others that have looked at it.
Okay, another question here. Are there any common pathways that liberals and conservatives share to get to a decarbonized future?
So what's really interesting about the data I showed you is that it's not the case that conservatives really oppose the decarbonization policies, or they strongly support the anti-decarbonization. They just don't hold those views as strongly as their liberal counterparts. And we actually saw that a similar finding, which reporters are talking about in the last election last week, which is when President Joe Biden, or President-elect, hopefully Joe Biden, talked about climate change, it actually made people in really blue states come out and vote for him, but it didn't actually necessarily bring out the vote in purple states, which is really interesting. And so I really do believe in targeting and tailoring these narratives to different groups and different people. But at the moment, we don't have a clear pathway forward. The one thing I will tell you is that one experiment that I did is that there was a wonderful meeting at the Headland Arts Center in California, in Marin County, where they brought together climate scientists, including myself, and climate artists. And I sort of just ran an experiment where I gave people, I grouped scientists and artists together, and I gave them one of the SSPs, which is the shared socio-political pathway. And you can look them up. They're really interesting to sort of see where will we end up in terms of climate mitigation. And I asked them to visualize what that future looks like. And some of the drawings were fascinating. So, but again, very hard to analyze drawings made by artists combined with scientists. But I think that would make sort of an interesting a starting point for us to sort of see what these futures look like. But to answer your question, no, we don't. I mean, I personally don't have a clear pathway forward, but there are coalitions. Like there's the CCL, which is sort of trying to combine Democrats and Republicans to pass a fee and dividend program for a carbon price, so on and so forth. But there are probably others on this call that know a lot more about that than I do. Thank you.
Okay, can faulty heuristics be dismissed in a straightforward manner, as in during a conversation, or does that require a longer process?
I've tried dismissing the faulty heuristic, but the problem is that they're very sticky and they're very cultural. We actually teach our kids when they're young, turn off the lights, and they bring it home to their parents. The same thing with recycling. So I think it's hard. We haven't looked at, I mean, that's one of the areas we're planning to pursue in the future is how do you break apart faulty heuristics, especially turning off the light. We do have a study that I mentioned, which actually looked at what is the reason why these faulty heuristics exist. And so what we found is education plays a pretty strong role, especially early childhood education. And so maybe more systems thinking there, but just simply telling someone, hey, this heuristic is wrong in a way that is not super salient is not going to help. And so maybe that's something that we need to look at. But again, it's an area of active research for us.
Maxine, do you want to ask one last question, maybe?
Sure. So this is a comment question about the speaker credibility. I guess this person's interested to know if, how often this issue is coming up about speaker credibility.
We don't have a measure. So this is just anecdotal. I presented this work at the AGU, which is the American Geophysical Union, a couple of years ago, not this year, but maybe last year or the year before that, just preliminary results. And I just polled people who sort of circled around me after the talk to ask me questions, whether they had been asked or whether they were sort of criticized for their carbon footprint. And in general, it seems like just from that anecdotal conversation that it seems like it's important, but I have no idea how prevalent it is, how many times people get asked. But I do know, again, from personal experience of giving a lot of talks, that I get asked, what am I doing and what can other people do, but not necessarily, what is a quantitative carbon footprint for me, which I think is a different question, because I haven't actually sat and done my own carbon footprint, but I have done lots of actions in my life to decrease my carbon footprint. So I know that doesn't quite answer very cleanly how prevalent this issue is, but the thing is, we can make it prevalent when we talk about it. So I can say, hey, these are the things I've done, and I can gain credibility from saying that. And so it's actually not, it's not just in the negative where I'm sort of dormant and, it happens or it does not happen. I can also say, hey, I don't tend to fly very much, or I'm vegan and vegetarian and I don't have kids, and this is what I'm doing. And you can do something totally different. This is no pressure on you, but these are the things that I'm doing actively to decrease my carbon footprint. So we can make it more prescriptive rather than sort of what do others expect from us, if that makes sense. So thank you for your question.
Thanks, Dr. Attari. I know it's been a long day for you, and we have so many great questions, a lot of interesting comments, and I'm very sorry that we can't get to everything. Thank you to everybody who participated, everybody who submitted questions. And I just wanted to mention again, you can register for the BECC conference using our discount code, which gets you the early bird rate right now. And it's actually not just for the next 2 days, it'll be until Tuesday. So that's a little secret for us. And please go to the BECC conference website, which is spelled incorrectly there. There's actually 3 C's, BECC conference. And we will see you in December at the conference, and then in January back on the next webinar. Thanks, Shahzeen. Thank you, Maxine, and take care, everybody.
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye. Stay safe.